I will start giving you the first question before I give to the floor. So you touch upon technology, urbanization, and then we have this topic about MSMEs. So, okay, so how do you see Indonesia's urbanization influencing MSMEs? And also, should we invest in like business hubs? You mentioned about creating new cities, and you actually, this is like a part of a region where it's an extended version of the capital city, the current capital, Jakarta. So this is like a new hub in a way where we are right now. So should we invest more in like business hubs, like you have a vision for charter cities?
Yeah. So let me be clear. What would be the investment that would be required? It would be an investment which is actually just like the investment that the city of New York made in I think it was 1811. In 1811, the city of New York was just a tiny part of the island that we know now as Manhattan. What the city did was hire a commission. The commission drew lines on a map that said, okay, here's the new Fifth Avenue. It's going to extend the whole way up the island. It will be this wide, much wider than streets had been in New York prior to that. And it was basically a message to everybody, don't build anything in the land that is basically a 90 to 100 foot wide strip where Fifth Avenue will be, because we're going to need that for mobility and connection. But they did that for 4th Avenue and 3rd and 6th and 8th and 9th and 10th. And all the cross streets, all they were lines on a map. So you don't have to go out and pour a lot of concrete. You don't have to build a lot of sewers or build schools, or you don't have to spend a lot. You just have to say, here's the space that will be devoted to the public, that will be used by the government in the future for mobility of vehicles, for pedestrians, for buses, for whatever use you'll want for it. And the amazing thing about the 1811 plan for New York is that at that point, they didn't even know what a bicycle was. So who knows what they thought we'd be doing with Fifth Avenue now, more than 200 years later. But they had the insight to know that if this is going to become a big city, you've got to have a lot of public space, because every person, every package, every wire, every pipe that's going to connect up all the people in this new city is got to go through that public space. And the reason urbanization fails so badly in so many parts of the world is that nobody does that when it's cheap, when it costs almost nothing. Nobody sets aside the public space as the connection mechanism for all the people that will come. So you get congestion, you get excess crowding, you have huge extra costs for building sewers and laying water pipes, and all those costs are about just the cost of acquiring the land. Most of it. The construction costs are never that high. So if you just set aside an area, say as big as Manhattan, and just say, here's the public space, here's the two-dimensional grid of public space that will be available for the future to use to connect up as best they can. And then inside that grid, you've got a whole bunch of land that private individuals can use to try and make a profit, building buildings and selling and using in various ways. If governments just made that commitment, here's the public space, but in a huge tract of land where there's potential for expanding, then you could replicate the success of New York. It wasn't the biggest city at that time in the United States, but it had a credible plan that involved a commitment to public space, but it didn't involve a lot of spending at the time.
I hope we still have the opportunity to build something like Manhattan. I doubt it. Maybe the new IKN will be exemplary for that.
Let me kind of push back. I just think there's enormous demand. But let me give you another illustration of this. the few cases we see around the world where people are thinking about very large-scale real estate developments, they always think, oh, let's build a city for the rich. Let's just attract people who have like college degrees and have them come here. Well, that's a losing strategy because there are lots of places where the rich can already go in the world, lots of good cities for them. The market that's untapped is poor people. So now, how, can you make a successful city by attracting poor people, people who might get their first job? Yes, you can. That's how New York City worked. It attracted something like 1 million immigrants from Europe. A lot of their first employment was in garment assembly, but yet they could go from that, once they had the opportunity of the city, to move up into higher valued forms of production, new skills, better opportunities for their children. So you can build very successfully if you create a place for millions of people to come and get their first job. So that opportunity exists and it won't go away, but it does take a reasonable amount of land to do it. If you try and do it with 100 hectares, forget it. You can't do it. You need something like the size of Singapore, something like 1,000 square kilometers, so 30 by 30 kilometers. It's not a big amount of land compared to like the size of Indonesia, but it's a bigger amount of land than a private developer can ever assemble.
Very well. Okay, let me take it back to our main topic today. And we have Pak Agus Sudiarto. Pak Agus Sudiarto from BRI as the Risk Management Director who would like to ask a question for you, Professor. Pak Agus, please show hands. I'll come to you for microphone. Silakan.
Thank you very much, Professor, for sharing your insight today. The question for me is, BRI as the...
I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing, so
okay.
Sorry.
Sorry.
You just speak up a little.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your sharing today. BRI is a public listed company. So is this possible for us as a public listed company to balancing between how to create the social value and how to create the economic value as the listed company? Because you said BRI have a role to push the SME business to grow the economic in Indonesia. Thank you.
Okay, I'll restate the question, but I was having a little trouble hearing, so tell me if I've got it wrong. You're asking what role can a private company, BRI, play in something so fundamental as preparing for better standards of living for the citizens of the future? Is that right? It's really about what's the role for a private company in doing something like that?
Yes,
okay.
Something like that.
So I think you're correct that there are limits on what a private company can do. Some people have talked about private firms building entire cities and replacing city government. I think that's a crazy idea. It will almost surely fail, and I wouldn't want to live in one of those cities anyway. I mean, think about the challenge of appointing the police chief in a city of 10 million. How do you delegate the responsibility of holding accountable the police chief to a private company or its shareholders or trustees? You can't do it. But what I do think you could do is have a large investor say, we're willing to work with any city in Indonesia. If you come to us with a plan where you say you're going to assemble, let's say, 500 square kilometers and make that be the area that we can help develop as the expansion area for some existing city. To get something of that size, again, like 1,000 square kilometers, which would be big enough for Shenzhen or Singapore, that's 30 by 30 kilometers. You'd almost surely have to use the powers of eminent domain to assemble a package of land that large. but a state or a province, local government could decide to do this. And then what BRI could say is any state or government that is willing to take the lead on this will be ready to come in and provide some of the initial investment. Because what are the micro enterprises that you're going to need in a city like this? Look at China. The first thing you need is somebody who's going to build dormitory housing. A few landlords who will build a place that workers could come live in, a very inexpensive place to then go work in a job. So you could be ready to say, we'll finance all the small entrepreneurs who want to become landlords and build the dormitory housing at first. Eventually, later we'll actually support people who want to build their own housing. We'll provide financing for firms, micro enterprises that are willing to move and set up their new operations in this new place. That kind of commitment to translate the land and the public space that a government can provide, to translate that into effective urban development, could then get cities and states to start pursuing this possibility of coming up with the land that create this opportunity. So I do think you have to work with local governments. It will succeed probably only if the national government endorses this approach. But you could still be a very important first mover. And I think the same is true about Aadhaar. You could just start, just get a few people from India to help you roll out Aadhaar numbers, offer them to all of your customers, and the adoption would start slowly, but it would start to build as people saw the benefits that they get from that. You could fund then the micro enterprises that build the software applications that let all kinds of things happen once you've got secure identification. So India, they've got a whole portfolio of digital applications that run on top of Aadhaar. So I think you could be a first mover that nudges the nation as a whole towards some big opportunities.
Very well. We have another question from Pak Ubaidillah Nugraha. Pak Ubaidillah Nugraha, please show hands so I can see you. Yes. I'll give the microphone to you or somebody. Tolong boleh diberikan mikrofonnya. You told me I only have 4 minutes left, so let's make the use of the time efficiently. Silakan, Pak Ubaidillah.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm a lecturer in international business, so my question is, how the best strategy for MSMC to expand internationally without losing their local, traditional, and community-based approach? Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Ubaidillah.
Well, I think, I didn't mention this, but I think one of the sources of uncertainty that you should have in mind right now is that the world may be less receptive to exports of goods, exports from Indonesia, less willing to accept imports. So it may be less willing to accept those exports from Indonesia in the next 20 years or 30 years than it was in the previous 20 or 30 years. If that's the possibility, and if that becomes the reality, maybe you shouldn't predicate everything about the development of an MSE on the possibility of exporting. You could think about developing small and medium enterprises to produce value for Indonesians. It's a little bit harder to do as a strategy for the whole country, because instead of just, say, specializing in garments and then importing other things, you've got to have some strategies for producing more things locally. But you could work with foreign firms who engage in direct foreign investment, who come and bring you some of those technologies that you don't have domestically. So I would not focus so much on just exports as the way forward. But beyond that, if you asked me what advice to give someone who wants to start a firm, I would say go someplace where you've got a chance to grow and succeed, and where the frictions, the congestion, the high rent, the high prices that your workers have to pay for rent. Go someplace where you don't face all of those frictions. Go to the new opportunity. And the question then is, well, where in Indonesia can we find those opportunities? That's where I think it's up to the BRI and the government to think about, we should create those kind of opportunities. That isn't that hard to do.
Very well. So I think we only have one question left. So I will use my right to give you another question. So as you know, BRI is one of the world's largest lenders for MSMEs. I love that you touch upon AI, the usage of AI. So how can we combine the use of AI, and then as we know that many Indonesian MSMEs, they rely on informal networks for capital and operational support. How can a financial institution like BRI formalize these networks, probably using AI, to create a more sustainable and also scalable coalition model?
Yeah. Well, I want to be very clear that I work for the whole world. I don't work for the United States or for any firm in the United States. I think BRI could even take the lead in trying to encourage a formal stance here in Indonesia that says we are opposed to proprietary AI. We will not do anything to help a few individuals, I mean a handful of people, have the possibility of controlling something as important as AI and capturing all the benefits from it. As part of that policy, I think Indonesia should say, because we're in favor of open source, we don't care if it's open sourced AI from China, from Europe, from the United States, but we are committed to the idea that this should be available for everyone, just like ORT. That means you won't get a multi-billion dollar, $100 billion firm by creating your own monopoly that monopolizes the use of AI. But the odds are that if you try to win in that race, you're going to lose anyway. So I think all countries in the middle income and developing world should say the big gains for us are going to come from open source, open science, and free dissemination of all of these kinds of results. BRI could help make that kind of statement and nudge the government forward. And you have to stand ready to resist if the United States tries to bully you and says, no, you can't use AI that somebody else got by copying our stuff. You gotta pay our monopolists for AI. Just say no.
Very well. So, okay, before we conclude, maybe something to ponder for our audience. So we're talking about getting out of the middle income trap, and MSMEs is the highlight for the conference, right? So facing uncertainty, the global uncertainty, also in Indonesia too, how can we move better in terms of policies, the players, BRI as a financial institution, to basically to prepare ourselves for the uncertainty, but also to grow, right? So what will be your best take on this, Professor?
Well, I guess it would be this. Read the story of the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 for New York City. Because this is a story of a few people. And a few people had tried and failed, but finally a few people said, we could build a city, and they thought maybe they could get to 1 million. They didn't realize how far they could go. We think we can actually make a plan and make it credible that we could get to 1 million. The question is, in today's world, where are the people who think so large, who imagine possibilities and pursue them? I'm afraid they're only creating monopoly businesses in Silicon Valley. The people who think big right now want to monopolize and control. And they're also doing it in ways that are dishonest. I think it's become a toxic culture. We need to go back to people who think big, but who think big in terms of what could be good for everyone. So if you can take away that vision of there are big things we could do if we set our minds to it, and I don't want to be just like Sam Altman at OpenAI or Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. I want to do something which is better than that. If you can keep that mindset, and if enough of the 280 million people in Indonesia think that way, you'll do fine.
So be bold, be bullish. Professor Paul Romer, everyone, please give a round of applause. Thank you very much, Professor.